It's Hugh Hewitt live in Studio West on this, the 21st day of February in the year of our Lord 2023. Vladimir Putin has just delivered the State of the Nation speech in Moscow, a day after President Biden's surprise visit to Kyiv in Ukraine, and before President Biden speaks in Poland. The Russian dictator claimed this morning that they started a war. That's a direct quote. They, the West, started a war, and we use force and continue to use it to stop it. Throughout the speech, Putin blames us, the West, you and me, everyone listening to this show, for forcing him to invade Ukraine and butcher thousands of people and spend the lives of tens of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians, kidnap thousands of children and take them back to all that he has done, he is blaming on you and me. It's sort of remarkable. The reverberations of Joe Biden's trip to Ukraine and of the speech today continue to thunder across the country and will be the topics of conversation across tables all throughout the day in the United States. How Joe Biden swept into Kyiv on a train from Poland amid a cloak of secrecy, writes the Telegraph this morning. Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, former prime ministers of Great Britain, speaking on the occasion of the president's speech, rose in Parliament to demand fighter planes be sent to Ukraine. And on it goes. Former ambassador and national security advisor Robert O'Brien appeared on Fox with Martha MacCallum yesterday to explain the American interests in the war in Ukraine. It's the best summary I found anywhere, cut number 7.
Well, Martha, here's what we've seen happen. The Chinese humiliated us with a trek across the United States over multiple days with a spy balloon. And it stopped and lingered over our nuclear sites, our silos. It stopped and lingered over the second leg of our triad, our Air Force bases with nuclear-capable bombers. And it then took a little stop by our sub pens to see what was going on with our submarine force. So it was an embarrassment, and that balloon should have been taken down forthwith as soon as we found out about it, probably as it entered American waters. The Chinese got away with it, and the only consequence is that Tony Blinken, instead of meeting with his foreign counterpart in China in Beijing, he met with Wang in Berlin, or in Munich, in Germany. So what was the consequence to the Chinese? So is there any wonder that they think they can get away with supplying lethal weapons to the Russians for their fight against Ukraine? And by the way, General Kellogg was absolutely right. You know, we've got to win this thing in Ukraine, and it's in America's interest to win it because China and Russia are unlimited partners. And if we can use the Ukrainians to totally degrade the Russian army and show that we can win one of these wars, that will deter Xi Jinping from invading Taiwan. So this is a very important fight in Ukraine, and it has serious implications with our relationship with China and what happens in Taiwan.
We had
the
lines of
Trump's
communication that we needed
most successful
to communicate.
And final national security advisor, Ambassador Robert O'Brien, who you've heard on this program many times. Senator Lindsey Graham, also on this week with Martha Raddatz, tried to explain this weekend about Putin and our interest. And I think it's important for Americans to continue to discuss and understand why we are pursuing this policy. Cut number 6.
I don't know. You know, a year ago, everybody here was in denial. I was preaching as loud as I could. Putin really means it. Here's the good news. I've never seen NATO so united. The Germans have stepped up to the plate. There's bipartisan support for winning this war in Ukraine, for giving the Ukrainians the weapons they need to defend themselves. I'm not worried about provoking Putin. I want to beat him. And how do you beat him? You beat him by giving the Ukrainians the military capability to drive the Russians out of Ukraine. You label Putin's Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. You create international tribunals so we actually can try Putin and his cronies in the international court like we did after World War II. Don't worry about provoking Putin. Worry about beating him. And I've never been
that
more
is
optimistic
the key thing. So last night I went on special report. And I know that in the Republican Party, there's a good 25 to 30%, and not a few leading figures who are very, very leery of more aid for Ukraine. And I'm not among them. I believe wholeheartedly in giving the Ukrainians what they need. Give them the tools, they will finish the job. So Brett Baer had the panel on last night, and of course we began with the president's surprise visit to Ukraine. And he turned to me and asked me what I thought about it, cut number 11.
Hugh, what do you make of the trip and reaction to it?
I think it's the best day of a beleaguered presidency by a lot, Brett. I think it's a significant historical moment, and all praise to the president for doing it. I was telling my radio audience this morning, I am reminded of not President Bush going to Iraq or President Obama making his trips or President Trump, but actually in 1940, FDR, who couldn't travel, sent Harry Hopkins in January of 41 to spend 2 weeks with Churchill in war-torn and bombed-out London. And at the end of it, Hopkins told Churchill from the Book of Ruth, "Whither thou goest, I goest, and your people are my people." Churchill wept. So for the people of Ukraine, this could not have come at a better time, and it's got to be the greatest morale booster for them possible. So great thumbs up to the president for doing it today. And so, some Republicans immediately jumped on me, and some of the conservatives who are against funding aid to Ukraine attack that. And that's fine. I understand there is a division. It's legitimate. I want people to understand, though, you can hold two thoughts. You can be very, very critical of Joe Biden, especially his complete abandonment of East Palestine, but at the same time support Ukraine. We did get around to that on the panel last night as well. Cut number 12.
Yeah. And what about that dichotomy, Hugh? Will it be striking? Will the former president try to bring that up? Because playing how Ukraine plays in the Republican primary will be a fascinating thing.
Well, the famous line is you can hold two thoughts. The administration's treatment of East Palestine, which is close to my heart, 40 miles from my hometown. It's a small town. It's 5,000 people. The East Palestine Bulldogs, the high school's under 300 kids. And they've destroyed the town. This train wreck has really hurt the town. And Pete Buttigieg hasn't been there, and you haven't seen the president there. And if he just touched down at Andrews and then got his way over to East Palestine, it would be another home run. But Donald Trump is very savvy in going up there, because Ohio is Trump country. Columbiana County is Trump country. Indeed, that whole Pennsylvania-Ohio border is Trump country. And he's going to pay attention to the people that the Biden administration hadn't had time to. But you can praise the trip to Ukraine and absolutely blast the Buttigieg-Biden response in Ohio. That's where I am. And I don't know if that's where you are. We took a lot of calls yesterday. We'll take more calls today. 1-800-520-1234. Let me begin by some other headlines. In the Washington Post this morning, rattled by China, U.S. and allies are beefing up defenses in the Pacific. We are in a great power struggle, like Cold War 2.0, and Americans are waking up to it. China is, by the Chinese Communist Party, is clearing the decks. Another of their top businessmen has been disappeared. Bao Fan, who is really one of the great investment bankers of China, has been banished by Xi Jinping and the totalitarian state there. There's been more tremors in Turkey, by the way, and Secretary of State Blinken was there yesterday, meeting with President Erdogan, standing by the people of Turkey. And I hope he was counseling him to get out of the way of the Sweden and Finland application for NATO. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is headed to East Palestine tomorrow, and Ron DeSantis was in New York City yesterday giving a speech about crime and punishment in the United States. The Wall Street Journal notes that Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis to court big money donors at dueling Palm Beach events. Look, the campaign is underway. Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis and Mike Pompeo and many, many others. Former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, current Texas Governor Greg Abbott, I think Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina, and others will be in this race, I think, by the start of it on the debate side in July or August of this summer. And it's going to be just wide open and wild and full of interesting people saying important things. Cut number 13, if you would, Dwayne, from last night's special report.
We're back with our panel. Hugh, he said as much. He's put out statements on Truth Social saying the more the merrier. When Nikki Haley got in, you've talked to the former president. Where's his mindset?
I think he's looking forward to a large stage full of combative would-be presidents about whom he's willing to compare and spar with. Governor DeSantis does have that book you mentioned, Brett, coming out, The Courage to be Free. That follows memoirs by Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo and Ambassador Haley. I expect Chris Sununu to get in. It's going to be a very talented field. But Donald Trump knows how to work a debate stage and how to work a Republican primary. I think everyone else has got pretty good media chops, too. You've interviewed them all. You know that. Ron DeSantis going to New York today, as you reported earlier, getting hit by Eric Adams. That's kind of a gift from Eric Adams to Ron DeSantis. I think he wants to go to every blue city and get beat up by
Stay
tuned, America. More coming up on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Welcome back, America. That music means David Drucker of The Dispatch joins me. David M. Drucker, there's so much going on, but I want to ask you the question I posed to Dwayne. If you had to guess how the Republican Party is split on continuing aid to Ukraine at the level at which it has existed presently and will continue to go, and on Joe Biden's trip to Kyiv, what do you think? What's the breakdown?
Well, I think that's a hard question to answer. Look, I think most elected Republicans, I say most, the majority, I mean at least 50% plus one, but probably more than that, believe in continuing to fund the Ukraine effort and keep them stocked with weapons and money so that they can resist the Russian invasion. I do think there's a good 25 to 30%, around 25% of the party that's skeptical of it. And some of the louder, more prominent voices in the party are critical of the effort and have talked about winding it down. And I think that can leave the impression that the party isn't foursquare behind the effort, and it leaves, a lot of questions as to what the next Republican president would do if this thing is still ongoing and there's a new Republican president in a couple of years. I have to think that the party supports the idea that President Biden went to Kyiv and is showing Vladimir Putin that we're not going anywhere.
Let me ask you about the trip itself. As I explained on Special Report last night, I think it's the best day of a bad presidency. So it's a low bar. It's been a terrible 25 months for Joe Biden in the country, but this was his best day. Some Republicans are mad at anyone saying anything good about Joe Biden, but, the one thing he can do is show up. He can't give much of a speech and he can't give an interview, but he can show up, and he did the best that he can do, I think, as an infirm 80-year-old, which is show up in a war zone. What do you think?
Well, I think that whoever would have been president should have been doing two things once the Russians invaded. Do everything they can, short of U.S. troops, to help Ukraine resist the invasion, and show up on Ukrainian soil to show both the Russians and our allies that we're serious about ensuring that the Ukrainians resist the invasion and ultimately repel it, and that we're not going anywhere. And I think showing up when you're an American president is a hugely important symbolic move. We saw George W. Bush show up at different times during his presidency in different places. I remember once notably in Iraq.
Thanksgiving, 2003, yep.
Yeah. These things are hugely important. They send a big message. The American president is unlike any other world leader. And so there's just no way to criticize it. You can criticize Joe Biden all day long for all sorts of things he's done or hasn't done, but I just don't see how there's anything negative about this.
So, David Drucker, let's wrap up by looking at what Governor DeSantis did yesterday, which was express skepticism about continuing to fund at this level, thereby suggesting a division in the party which could endure and deepen as we approach the debates, and will be healthy for the country to have this conversation, by the way. I welcome it, actually. I don't know where everyone on the Republican stage is going to come down on this, but it seemed to me that DeSantis is very sincere in this, and he's a combat veteran of Iraq. He is going to be very serious about this. How deep is the split in the announced candidate? Nikki Haley is all for the effort. Ron DeSantis is skeptical. Donald Trump is in between. I just don't have any idea how this is going to play in the primaries.
I'm not sure either, but I know that there are there's a significant portion of what we like to think of as the committed Republican voting base, right, and the populist wing of the party, which has over the past years been ascendant, that are skeptical not just of foreign intervention and sending American troops abroad, but spending American resources abroad. And they haven't seemed to put together the fact that how the United States handles the Russian invasion of Ukraine is going to have a direct impact on how China views American resolve vis-a-vis Taiwan and the Asia Pacific.
And do people
And
think it's a skeptical of national security mattering in a presidential primary? I go back to the campaign for the 1980 nomination. Ronald Reagan became our nominee because of his opposition to the Panama Canal Treaty. A lot of other things. He won because Jimmy Carter was a terrible president. God bless the former president as he enters his last days on this earth. But I do think that Reagan won because he campaigned on national security embodied in the Canal Treaty. And I think we're going to see some Republicans campaign on national security embodied in aid to Ukraine. 1 minute, David.
well, I think that's true, but I just think it depends on where the base shakes out. Look, the country in 1980 and the Republican Party, I think, was hungry for a voice that was going to oppose the Soviet Union aggressively and treat American resolve as something to buttress. And we've been in a place where the party's been split and less hawkish in certain elements of the party. And I think we'll see some of the candidates respond to those less hawkish voices as they look for advantage in a primary. I think the question is where they see the incentive structures writ large.
David M. Drucker on Twitter with the Dispatch, one of America's finest political essayists and observers. Thank you, David, for joining me. Byron. Morning, glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt, live from the West Coast. Recounting for you the continued after effects of President Biden's trip to Kyiv yesterday, Vladimir Putin's just ridiculous speech this morning from the Kremlin about how the West made us do it. And joined now by Byron York of the Washington Examiner and Fox News. Byron, good morning. What's your assessment of President Biden's trip and the aftermath?
Well, the word I hear used to describe the trip very often is symbolic. And I thought as a symbolic trip, I don't think it accomplished an enormous amount. I thought it was extraordinarily risky and a bad idea. I mean, the President Bush, Obama, and Trump's trips to Afghanistan and to Iraq were to countries where the United States was actually at war, that were just filled with United States military assets to assure that nothing bad would happen to the president. I thought this was obviously Ukraine is not that, and I thought it was risky and just did not accomplish an extraordinary amount.
Well, we agree that it is risky, but we disagree on what it accomplished. As I said to Brett Baer last night, I think it was the best day of a terrible presidency. Now, that's a low bar, Byron, but the impact it has on the Ukrainian people is enormous. The impact it has, I think, on Xi Jinping and Putin, maybe even Khamenei, in terms of reassessing what Biden will and will not do, is significant. And probably the best he could do, given his infirmity, his inability to communicate in speech or interview, the best thing he can do is actually walk around with Zelensky in the middle of Kyiv.
Well, I heard you, I think you mentioned Harry Hopkins.
Yes, 1941, January.
Yeah, the problem with that, of course, is it's one of the steps that led to World War, to a global conflagration that left tens of millions of people dead. So, you spoke about it in kind of a chipper way, and you thought, well, gee, I don't know if that's really the step I want to be on.
Well, let me make sure the audience that the war has not reached America in January of 1941. It has engulfed Europe for a year and a half, and the Battle of Britain was 5 months underway when Hopkins went to London.
Well, yes, but there was a big war not long after that. I mean, it was going on, but I mean, the United States got involved not long after that. So I just don't think that's the way to sell it to people who are skeptical.
Well, I'm not trying to sell it. I'm trying to describe its after effects. I'm selling it as in our national interest. And I'm going to have to talk to Senator Cotton and Mollie Hemingway next hour, and they are on different ends of the Republican spectrum about this. How do you see that spectrum falling out, Byron? Where do you put the Republican Party in terms of percentages? Because I'm a hawk. I think this is great, and we should keep doing it. Give them the A-10s and the F-16s. Don't send men, send money and tools.
A couple of things to think about. One, I wrote about this last month. I think there was a Center for Strategic and International Studies report about the munitions that the United States has given Ukraine, and almost to the extent that we're kind of disarming ourselves to arm Ukraine. The number of javelins given to the Ukraine equals, since as of August of last year, equals 7 years of production, 1 million rounds of 155 millimeter howitzer ammunition, so much that we ran out of ammunition to give them and started giving them 105 millimeters instead. So I think a number, and also at the same time, CSIS did a war game over a conflict over the Taiwan Strait, and found that the United States would run out of some critical munitions within a week. So at a time when the United States doesn't have enough to defend itself, we're ramping up and trying to produce more to send to Ukraine. That said, when someone like Ron DeSantis and a lot of other Republicans, Kevin McCarthy and others, say they do not support a blank check for Ukraine, I'm sympathetic to that view, but I think you have to start saying, well, how big a check would you support? I mean, let's say it's reasonable to not support infinite arms transfers to Ukraine. How much do you support? Have we gone past where you support right now? Do you worry that we would go past the tanks, the F-16s in the future? What's your line? And I think people have a hard time kind of drawing a line, which is the nature of these things, because we now have this almost World War I-like conflict in Ukraine where they're just shooting artillery to each other, just using up mad amounts of munitions doing this. And there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of progress, so people are demanding that we escalate. Well, we got to give them the tanks, got to give them the tanks, got to give them the F-16s. And so I think people who see danger in this process should draw a line somewhere and say, no, let's stop here.
And I think my argument is that there is more dangerous in allowing Putin to win, and he's not going to stop unless he's defeated. And Ron DeSantis made a very careful, calibrated comment because there are lots of problems with the Biden approach. Cotton talks about it all the time, Senator Cotton. Why are we doing these mincing step-by-step escalation? It is like LBJ in Vietnam, as opposed to trying and providing them with the weapons that will drive the Russians out but not carry the war into Russia. That's why the A-10 is different from the F-16 and why a HIMAR is not a tactical nuke. I mean, it all depends on what you're giving them and what your goal is. And I think what you landed on there, Byron, is what every Republican who wants to be president has to talk about now and anticipate where the war will be in 9 months, because it could be anywhere in 9 months, right?
Well, it could be in roughly the same place in 9 months. That's another possibility, and then that's the World War I aspect of it.
But on the debate stage, the Republican candidates, and they're all over the place, from Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley as hawks to Donald Trump, who goes back and forth, to Ron DeSantis, who's a Ukraine skeptic or persuadable but leery of it. I don't know about Chris Sununu and Greg Abbott and everybody else who might jump in. It's a difficult, complicated problem. I would not let consultants drive my answers on this one, though. I don't think Ron DeSantis did. I don't think Trump is. This really gets to who you are as a person and how you view the West, I think.
Well, as far as the Republican base is concerned, certainly the Trump-supporting base, a lot of them will cite the fact that Trump didn't start any new wars as a reason for their support of Trump. So if those candidates are trying to appeal to that part of the base, then I'm not sure this Ukraine position is actually going to work. And I do remember covering the 2016 campaign extensively. Trump basically came out and said, Iraq, the United States invasion and war in Iraq was just a total disaster, started as a mistake by George W. Bush. And you would have thought he was speaking to a conference of the nation or something, and yet it actually worked with a lot of the Republican base. So I think that there was kind of a post-Bush reckoning among some in the Republican Party about some of these sort of foreign entanglements that gotten involved in.
Now, do you
Ukraine,
think
I'm not sure where they're going to come down on it.
Neither am I. I think you could devote an entire debate on national security, many debates on national security, the China, Russia, Iran axis, the best policy, how much to give where, and how long we'll do it for. And the answer is you're really going to have to listen closely and find out who persuades Republican primary voters and the handful of independents who participate with them. Because Reagan got the nomination on the Panama Canal and on opposing the Soviets with clear-eyed resolve. I think that heart still beats in the Republican Party, Byron York.
That was in the context of a Cold War that was just remarkably different from today's circumstances. And I've actually been thinking recently about the concept of what's called zombie Reaganism. And I think it's still alive and well in the Republican Party. And as a matter of fact, I think the biggest issue, literally the biggest issue of the 2024 Republican race is there any going back? I mean, do people go back to a kind of republicanism that existed from Reagan through Bush and McCain and Romney, or has Trump changed it so significantly that there's simply no going back? And I think foreign policy is going to be one of those areas.
Always perceptive. Byron York on Twitter and the Washington Examiner on Fox News. Thank you, Byron. Your phone call's coming up, 1-800-520-1234. Connect you to me, Hugh Hewitt. We're talking about Biden and Putin on Ukraine, the Republicans on Ukraine, and your opinions on Ukraine and American aid to it right here. Welcome back, America. Bethany Mandel is one of my regular contributors. Good morning, Bethany. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I don't know where you are on Ukraine, but the Republican base is kind of split. Next I'll have on Mollie Hemingway and Tom Cotton, sort of the alpha and the omega of the Republican positions on Ukraine. Where's Bethany Mandel?
So I think I'm where a lot of Americans are, and semi-apathetic. And I think it's because we all have really short attention spans, that this has been going on now for a year. And I think a lot of Americans have sort of checked out a little bit. I enjoyed the back and forth that you had with a lot of callers, because I think ultimately the goal is victory. And at this point, it's low-hanging fruit. We can kind of kick them when they're down. But I'm afraid that the majority of Americans don't care anymore, because it's been going on for too long. And they've never had it explained beyond sort of talking points of this is the noble thing to do. A lot of the Ukraine talking points sound a lot like COVID talking points, that it's been put into two black and white terms, and it's been sort of messaged as this is the noble thing to do, whereas people don't want to do what's noble. They want to do what's pragmatic. And I don't think that we've had a national conversation to explain to Americans, like, this is the threat that Russia poses, and this is why we're doing it for the sake of our national security. And we don't care about doing what's noble for Ukraine. That's not the objective here. We can't go and fight every single war in every single place in the world, but this specific conflict makes sense for us to get involved in a limited way. And we promise that it is in a limited way. And one of your callers sort of mentioned, I think we're going to go in. And that speaks to a lack of trust from the Biden administration, because that trust has been broken on a million different things over the course of his presidency over the last 2 years.
As I said to Brett Baer last night, it was the best day of a terrible presidency. And when he went to Kyiv. And it is a terrible presidency, and that credibility problem, he collapsed in Afghanistan. This would not have happened had he not done that. So how does Neville Chamberlain get Munich back? You got to bring Churchill into your cabinet. And Joe Biden doesn't have the ability he can't message. But the best thing he could do was show up, because he can't talk. He can't persuade. He won't even give interviews, Bethany. The best thing he can do is just show up.
Yeah, and I think it was I think the point and the power of his visit isn't over here. I'm not sure how much people are paying attention over here, other than maybe being resentful that he's there and not in Ohio, because that's how Trump is messaging it. He's messaging it that Biden's in Ukraine while I'm in Ohio. But I think the power is in Ukraine. I think that people there are going to feel this balloon of confidence when they've been beat into submission. And the war crimes that have happened there are also not really talked about. But the last year has been horrifying for people in Ukraine. And I think that this gave them a lot of confidence to keep up the fight and to keep up the push. And I think that this is a story that will pass off the American radar in the next couple days, but it won't in Ukraine.
You know, Bethany, I approach this with my grandchildren in mind. I think this is a horrible man, a true tyrant. And I think he's part of an axis of evil that really begins in Beijing, but extends to Khamenei in Iran and Putin in the Kremlin. Is the American people getting that? I mean, I don't even think it's a close call that this is in our interest.
I don't think the American people are getting that. And I think that, you're right that the axis of evil starts in Beijing. And I've always been confused and concerned by the fact that Americans don't seem interested in the origins of how COVID started and China's involvement in any way. And I think that even sort of stepping back from conspiracy theories that, are not probably conspiracy theories, but they knew a lot and they didn't do anything. And the level of anger that Americans should feel towards China is off the charts. I mean, they just destroyed our society. They destroyed our economy.
The key is should. The key there is should.
Yeah,
we don't.
exactly.
We should.
Exactly. And so if we don't understand the level of anger that we should have towards China, there's no way it will sink in when it comes to Russia.
Now, this is the challenge, and I know Joe Biden is just challenged. He can't give a speech. Kamala Harris is incoherent. There is, Secretary Austin is invisible. Tony Blinken is uninspiring. It is the weakest national security team of my lifetime. Well, at least since Carter, and I think Carter was better than this.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I think that's a little too generous, but I don't want to crap on Carter right now.
Yeah, the last year of his presidency marked a turning point when he got over his, quote, inordinate fear of communism. Bethany Mandel, thank you. As always, follow her on Twitter, Bethany Shondar. Keep coming back, Bethany. Up next, Mollie Hemingway joins me. She is on the skeptic end of the conservative spectrum about aid to Ukraine, followed by Senator Cotton, who's on the hawkish end, as I am on aid to Ukraine. And we'll continue this conversation because really, I don't think there's a more important conversation in America than this one. And the case has to be made, and President Biden can't make it. He did the best thing he could possibly do by showing up. And what Bethany just mentioned, the impact on the Ukrainian is the effort is so profound and will endure even as Americans move on to their next controversy and political debate. Stay tuned, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Coming up, Mollie Hemingway. I think it's the best day of a beleaguered presidency by a lot, Brett. I think it's a significant historical moment, and all praise to the president for doing it. I was telling my radio audience this morning, I am reminded of not President Bush going to Iraq or President Obama making his trips or President Trump, but actually in 1940, FDR, who couldn't travel, sent Harry Hopkins in January of 41 to spend 2 weeks with Churchill in war-torn and bombed-out London. And at the end of it, Hopkins told Churchill from the Book of Ruth, whither thou goest, I goest, and your people are my people. Churchill wept. So for the people of Ukraine, this could not have come at a better time, and it's got to be the greatest morale booster for them possible. So great thumbs up to the president for doing it today. Now, welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. That is not by any means the uncontested majority opinion on the conservative side. Mollie Hemingway is the opposite end of the spectrum from me, I think, and from my guest later in the hour, Senator Cotton. So I wanted to have on this morning people who may take a different view from me. Good morning, Mollie. How are you?
Great to be here with you.
I do want to get to Ukraine. I got to ask you first. You've blurbed a lot of books, right?
I have done my fair share.
I've done my fair share, too. I just sent an 1,100-word blurb. Have you ever done that to anyone?
No, that's impressive. I hope the book was worth it.
Oh, it is. It's Judge Thapar's book about Clarence Thomas. And I hate to gush, but I said to him, give this all to your publisher. Let him use 10 words or all 1,100. I don't care. I don't know what to do. I don't want to. You know what the problem is when you run into a great book.
Yes.
It is?
I don't know. What is it?
It's how to communicate that someone who's picking it up in a bookstore should read it. That's the art of the blurb.
For the blurb. So I actually did get to read an advanced copy of this, and I completely agree with you. This is a great book. And I also am already biased because I love Justice Thomas. But that is what I was kind of thinking was, I love this book. I would love other people to read it. And there were so many things to say about it. I actually kind of had the opposite problem. I didn't know where to go with it. And I should have just written 1,100 words to convey how great it is, how superb it is. How I kind of thought it was like two books in one, too, which I love for a Supreme Court book. You know, it's about Justice Thomas and his life. It's also about, you know, this like originalist understanding that he has displayed in his opinions. But it's so readable and it's great. So I'm glad that you enjoy it too.
Well, I also think it's a third thing. As a con law professor, we always teach the cases. As a reporter and a journalist, we teach the headlines and the takeaways. But there are people involved. There are real people involved. And Judge Thapar brings Clarence Thomas's compassion for the real people to bear on these things.
Yes, I love it. It really, I've always felt that about Justice Thomas, but he does a great job of showing that there are victims in all of these cases that need to have their wrongs righted.
It's justice. Now, Mollie, let's get to Ukraine. I'm just going to give you the open forum. What did you think of the president's trip?
I definitely did not think anything along the lines of what you thought, and I don't really there are many problems I have with this kind of trip, and it really starts with just a disagreement about this approach to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which I think we all agree is a problem. I think the U.S. has been involved in this war without thinking strategically about what it wants to accomplish and what its involvement will do. I saw all these people complaining about if China were to help Russia by giving weapons, that would prolong the war. Well, that's true, and that's what we're doing. We're prolonging a war here. We've not been pushing for peaceful reconciliation. If he used this trip as a means to get everybody to the table to end this horrific war, I would be much more impressed, but I don't see that happening. It sounds like people just want to prolong things, spend money without a clear strategy, without an understanding of where we're going, and without any understanding of how it serves our national interests.
All right, now, Mollie, I think it's a necessary step. The aid to Ukraine is a necessary step to stop the new axis of evil, which is anchored in Beijing and has an arm in Tehran and another arm in Moscow, and to stop the particular disaster that is the Ukrainian butchery from going forward. We got to defeat Putin. My end game is that the people in the Kremlin just have a Khrushchev day where all of a sudden Putin's gone. And that's my end game. And I don't think we get there any other way. And if Putin gets to the border, if he absorbs all of Ukraine, I think we're in, it's sort of like the Sudetenland followed by Czechoslovakia, followed by Poland in the 30s. You don't agree, obviously.
People who support this type of prolonging of this war kind of are all over the place. They went from saying we had to do this because otherwise he's going to take over all of Europe, which doesn't seem to match with how he even thinks in terms of whether he would go after an actual NATO country. But there's also the issue that we have seen in this war that the Russian army is not capable of doing that. That's actually one of the great things we've seen in this war. So I'm not so worried about that, but I am worried about further driving China and Russia together and Iran. You don't want to give them opportunity. It's like the opposite of the approach we took in the 70s, where we understood that we had to kind of work with China so that we could go after the Soviet Union. We're just driving them all together. We have not gotten the support of the world in this, and so it makes us weaker at a time that we should be stronger against China. We should be pivoting and thinking really about how we can take on this adversary, China.
Well, I can hold two thoughts. I can agree with the second thing you said and disagree profoundly with the first thing. But Mollie, let's give each other a test. The best case against the Biden approach is that it's been incoherent and it's self-provocative. I know what the best case is against the approach he's pursued. What is the best case for his approach, Mollie?
I would say, I don't know, the best case might be that he has shown some restraint. I mean, the big risk when you go to war with Russia is that they have 6,500 nuclear warheads. We've done a lot of arming and amplifying this effort, but we haven't gotten as far as to provoke a nuclear response. That might be the best I can say.
I think the best thing that can be said is that China has not yet gotten involved and that we've caused the Kremlin to reel backwards and that we could possibly win. But the worst part is that Biden, and now I want to go to my closing argument, Biden can't do anything else better than what he did yesterday because he can't talk, he can't persuade, he won't give interviews, he cannot deliver an effective speech. And his vice president is worse at it. His secretary of defense is a sphinx, and his secretary of state is unimpressive. I don't know that there's anything better he could have done than what he did yesterday.
So it was very theatrical. I don't actually think that Russians or Putin responds to theatrics. I don't think it actually affects that. I thought, like, for instance, that they had them, the CNN was reporting that there hadn't been air raid sirens forever. Russia knew that Biden was there, but the air raid sirens go off a few minutes before Biden shows up. Very theatrical things. Some people are very affected by that. I actually think U.S. foreign policy elites tend to be very affected by that more than anyone else. But I'm not sure. I think it's reckless. I mean, imagine if something happened when some of these high-profile people are visiting Ukraine, and we say we don't want to be drawn into a full-on war with the nuclear power Russia. We say that we don't want that. We say that we don't want things to spiral out of control. But if something happens, some accident happens, some stray missile strikes while Jill Biden or Joe Biden or one of these top senators is there, this is very reminiscent of how World War I gets going. Not that people are actually trying to get into a world war, but a bunch of mistakes happen or a bunch of people making steps without thinking through what the consequences are. And that's the war. Everyone talks about World War II as the thing we have to keep in mind, and Neville Chamberlain. But World War I is the other thing we should be keeping in mind about how horrific global conflict can break out because people are stumbling toward it.
Well, that's a fine cautionary reminder. I remind people of Harry Hopkins going to London in 1941 because the audience for this is not really Americans or foreign policy elite. The audience is the Ukrainian people who've been, and I know you have a heart for this, Mollie, thousands of Ukrainian children have been kidnapped. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been killed by a butcher. He's a war criminal. We can't not do anything.
This is one thing I am very appreciative of, that everyone in America seems to agree at least about this. The wrong being done to Ukraine, the horror being done on its people. The question is whether it's better to keep this war. The way the Americans have been fighting wars recently is to just prolong them for a couple of decades, spend a lot of money, not have a clear strategy, and then after 20 years or so, get out. That is not a good model for the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people do have this adversary on their border. The entire approach we've taken for decades has not really been helping Ukrainian people navigate a peace in the surroundings that they are physically in. And so I do think that if you care about the Ukrainian people, the children, the women, the displaced, what's happening to their men, that you would work as statesmen to get this war ended as quickly as possible.
Mollie Hemingway, always great to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you like Judge the Par as well. It's just such an amazing book. The People's Justice isn't available yet, but Mollie, very rare to find two people who've read the same unpublished book.